Hello, my friend. Today I will tell you another long-forgotten legend. Close your eyes and let the magic transport you to Middle-earth. Our journey begins. In the age when the world was younger and the stars still burned with the bright silver of the elves' first songs, there came a gift draped in gold and silence. It was a gift of power wrapped in promises, whispered not by friend, but by the voice of the dark. 9 rings, each wrought with subtle magic, were offered to mortal kings. Lords of men who ruled vast lands, whose hearts beat with pride, and whose eyes searched always for more. More time, more glory, more legacy. They were wise, or so they believed, and brave, or so their songs once claimed. But the rings cared little for such things, for within each gift lived the will of Sauron the Deceiver, and through them his voice would soon weave into the marrow of those who wore them. The kings took the rings. They took them with hands that had held scepters, signed decrees, held newborn sons, and struck down their enemies. They took them with voices that had blessed harvests, commanded armies, and whispered lullabies. They took them believing they were masters of their fate, chosen among men, exalted by destiny. And for a time it seemed they were right. Their kingdoms flourished, their lives lengthened beyond mortal reckoning, untouched by age or illness. Their power grew like ivy over stone, wrapping around every corner of their dominion. The people bowed deeper, the wealth piled higher, the winds whispered their names with reverence, and even the stars seemed to shine longer for them. But the rings, the rings had other plans. Slowly, softly, like a shadow stretching at dusk, the change came. First in their dreams, which began to tremble with strange winds and distant eyes. Then in their waking, when food lost its taste and color began to fade from the world. They stopped laughing. They stopped sleeping. They stopped seeing the sun as warm and began to flinch at its light. And in time, they vanished. Not all at once, no, the Dark Lord was patient. One by one their names fell silent. Their thrones stood empty. Their cities turned cold. Their hearts, once ablaze with ambition, flickered into silence. The kings were no longer kings. They had become something else entirely. Their bodies faded into shadows, their voices into wails on the wind. The world forgot who they had been. But they remembered. In secret, they rode. They became the Ringwraiths, the Nazgûl, the 9. Cloaked in black, crowned in silence, they wandered Middle-earth as Sauron's dread servants. Each step they took turned the grass to ash. Each breath they drew chilled the air. They did not hunger. They did not thirst. They obeyed. Yet beneath the veil of shadow, behind the shrieks that split the sky, fragments remained. Memories, echoes of laughter long gone, the taste of sweet wine, the scent of cedar and smoke, the sound of a child's voice calling, "Father." These things flickered at the edge of their being, painful, haunting, fleeting. They did not speak of them, but they knew. There was once one among them who had ruled in the north, a king with hair like dusk and eyes that could command storms. He had stood atop snowy cliffs and sung to the wind once. He had held his wife's hands in winter and whispered her name into her hair. Now he walked in silence, his crown invisible, his name forgotten. The stars he once admired recoiled from him, and yet, sometimes, when the mist parted and the world was still, he would pause and turn his head as if listening for a song he could no longer hear. Another had been a prince of Harad, whose palace had been carved into the red cliffs like a jewel set in the earth. His halls had echoed with music, and his steps had once been followed by petals scattered by handmaidens who feared neither death nor love. He had worn silks, and his laugh had drawn the envy of poets. Now he rode in armor that drank the light, and his voice was a hiss, a memory of fire and sand. And so the nine drifted through time, their stories bleeding into legend, their faces erased from the world. To the people of Middle-earth, they were no longer men. They were myths, nightmares, whispered curses that haunted campfires and creaked in the bones of old trees. But the Nazgûl were not myths. They were real, and they had not forgotten. When Sauron stirred again in the east, like a storm rising beneath the earth, it was they he summoned. The Eye, wreathed in flame, called out, and across the barren lands, through forest and mountain, the nine awoke. One by one they rose, their cloaks catching no wind, their forms shrouded in cold. They did not speak. They did not need to, for the ring had been found. And so the hunt began, not in haste nor in rage, but in silence. For silence was the language of death, and the nine, worried scribes, crossed the Anduin beneath the pale moonlight. Their black steeds carried them with no hoofbeat, no breath, no soul. Birds fell silent, waters stilled. Even the stars turned their faces away, and the world, feeling their passage, trembled. But still they remembered, even as they searched the world for the one that bound them, tiny, distant, buried under layers of shadow and command. They longed not for the ring, but for the things they had once loved. A single name, a single note of music, a single sunrise. And that, perhaps, was the cruelest curse of all, for while others feared them, they feared memory, and memory followed them like a shadow they could never outrun. Even wraiths dream, and sometimes, in the darkness between days, the dreams return. Night fell over Middle-earth like a slow, sorrowful sigh, a breath drawn deep into the lungs of a grieving world. The stars, distant and glimmering like tears suspended in the vault of the heavens, cast their wan light upon a landscape steeped in silence. And beneath that dome of eternal quiet, the Ringwraiths rode, not with the fury of storm, nor the fire of wrath, but with a hush that drained the color from the earth and left behind only stillness. They did not gallop so much as glide, their steeds black as obsidian and silent as the grave. Hooves never clattering, eyes never blinking. They moved through forest and fen, over ruined bridges and ancient paths swallowed by moss and root, as if they were thoughts made manifest, specters born not of flesh, but of intention alone. At the head of the nine rode the Witch King, his crown invisible, yet more terrible than any wrought by goldsmith's hand. Around him the wind dared not stir, and the grass at his passage bent, not as though pressed by force, but as though in supplication. He was the first to fall to the power of the ring, the first king to trade his name for command, his soul for silence. And within him still echoed the hollow music of that choice, the long, slow unraveling of memory into myth. They paused at the edge of the weather hills beneath the twisted silhouette of a leafless elm whose branches clawed the sky like the fingers of a drowning man. The moon was pale, reluctant, and its light spilled unevenly over the broken stones of the old road, illuminating the scattered bones of beasts long dead, their stories forgotten by time. The Witch King turned toward one of his brethren who, once, long ago, had been a scholar king of the East, a man whose halls had been lined with scrolls older than Gondor, whose dreams had stretched beyond the stars. Now his voice was a whisper like wind against dry parchment, his thoughts fragmented like shattered runes. "Do you feel it?" The Witch King's voice was as soft as the rustle of autumn leaves, yet it carried through the gloom like a tolling bell in a land of the dead. The world shifts. The ring is close. And yet, there is something else. The other Nazgûl tilted his hooded head, and though no eyes could be seen, the air shimmered with the weight of his focus. His reply was measured, and within it danced the cadence of old oaths and the echoes of ancient debate. "Yes," he murmured, as though each word cost him a measure of pain. "The air thickens with memory. The trees remember us, even if they do not wish to. The stones remember. The wind tries to forget." There was a long pause, and in that stillness the night deepened, stretching outward like ink spilled across a map. "I remember," the scholar wraith continued, his voice trembling like candlelight in a cold room. "The scent of papyrus, warmed by sunlight, the dust of old libraries clinging to my robe. I remember the way my daughter laughed when I told her stories of the stars. She had eyes like polished amber, and her voice, it rang like chimes in the desert wind." He paused, and his form seemed to waver, to fray at the edges like cloth soaked in sorrow. "But her name is gone from me. I chased immortality and found only the silence of forgetting." The Witch King turned away, his form rigid, the folds of his cloak unmoving despite the breeze that whispered through the rocks. When he spoke again, it was with the calm of a man long reconciled with torment, though not at peace with it. "What we remember is a cruelty. What we forget is a wound. We are caught between the two, like leaves suspended on the current of a river we can never escape." His lands had been green and rich, his. His lands had been green and rich, his people loyal, their banners white with the symbol of a rising sun. He had loved the sea, had stood at dawn on the high cliffs and sung to it as if it were a goddess. But the sea no longer sang to him. It recoiled. Now even the tide turned at his approach. "Do you think," he asked, his voice raw as wind over broken glass, "that we could have chosen differently? That there was a moment when, had we looked the other way, we might have escaped this fate?" No answer came at once, for such a question was not easily met. The Witch King was still. The others shifted in their saddles, their cloaks stirring faintly like shrouds over forgotten tombs. The elm above them groaned under the weight of its own age, and from its high branches a single dead leaf fluttered down, spiraling like a lost thought. At last the Witch King spoke, and there was in his voice the cold echo of prophecy and something darker, resignation. "There is no path through the forest once you burn the trees behind you. We did not walk into shadow, we became it. Choice was the first illusion. Memory, the last kindness." Far away, A wolf howled, a long, sorrowful note that curled through the hills and echoed back like a question left unanswered. The horses, restless beneath their riders, pawed the earth as if they too sought a way out, a door back into the world of sun and voice and heartbeat. And then the Witch King raised his arm, a gesture slow and deliberate, and the nine turned as one, guiding their steeds toward the north. The wind grew colder, the stars dimmer, as if the sky itself shrank from their passage. The road ahead wound through forgotten ruins and tangled woods, through the dreams of sleeping stones and the nightmares of the weary earth. They did not speak again that night, but in the silence that followed, each wraith felt the echo of the question ringing in the bones of the world. If a man becomes a shadow, does he still dream of light? And somewhere, faint and almost imperceptible, a fragment of a melody stirred in the wind. A lullaby, perhaps, or a prayer. But it was not for them. It was never for them. Over the ridges of the northern hills, with the pale light unfurling over the ridges of the northern hills, with the softness of ash settling after a fire long burned. The clouds moved slowly, heavy with unfallen rain, and the wind crawled across the land like something injured, low and persistent, whispering not in gusts, but in broken murmurs, as though recounting secrets too old for even the mountains to remember. The land itself seemed hesitant, unwilling to stir beneath the hooves of the nine, its trees skeletal, its rivers thin, its stones watching silently, as if waiting for something terrible that had already passed, but might return nonetheless. They rode through the silence with the solemnity of a funeral procession, though no bier was borne and no mourning sung. The Witch King led them northward along the remains of a road built in another age, an age when kings still built for beauty, and roads were made not just to carry armies, but to guide pilgrims to places where wonder still bloomed. Now the road was cracked and crooked, overgrown in places by stubborn grass and gnarled roots that curled like the fingers of buried giants. The stones beneath their steeds' feet were slick with dew and veiled in the sorrow of forgotten footsteps. It was in this solemn march that one among the nine, a tall wraith whose bearing spoke still of dignity even beneath the black hood of his ruin, slowed his mount until he rode beside the Witch King. His name, once spoken with reverence by sailors and wise men, was lost now. But he had been a sea king, a lord of isles bathed in sunlight and storm. His voice, when he chose to use it, was deeper than the others, like the echo of waves in a cave of basalt and bone. And as he spoke, his words unspooled like kelp drifting in the tide, slow, graceful, weighted with memory. "There was a time," he said, his tone a meditation more than a statement, "when the winds sang to me, when I stood at the helm of my vessel and listened, truly listened, to the salt in the air, the cry of gulls, the creak of wood beneath me. And I believed the sea itself was speaking, not in the tongue of men, but in something older, something truer. I thought myself part of it, a chosen voice in the great chorus of the world." And now he fell silent for a moment, as if even in this half-life he needed to gather breath to brace against what he was about to admit. Now the sea does not speak. It recedes, not with anger nor with grief, but with indifference, as if it has forgotten I was ever its child. The Witch King's head turned slightly, though no face could be seen beneath the folds of his hood. When he replied, it was with the cool deliberation of one who had long since accepted the truths that others still tried to resist. "The world forgets us," he said, "because it must. That is its mercy. It shrouds its wounds in moss and shadow and calls it growth. Even the sun turns its face from us, not in cruelty, but in healing. We are the reminder it cannot bear." "But do you not feel it?" the sea wraith pressed, and his voice trembled not with fear, but with yearning, raw and unmet. "There is something still within us, a flicker, a flame behind the veil. We were not born in shadow. We were men once. Do you not feel the ache of it, like a phantom limb that can never be touched again?" For a long time the Witch King said nothing, and only the sound of the wind moved between them, weaving through the boughs of nearby trees like fingers through the threads of an old tapestry. Finally he spoke, slower than before, each word a stone carefully placed in a cairn for the dead. "Yes," he said, "I feel it, but it is not a flame. It is not warmth. It is a wound that has forgotten how to bleed, but not how to throb. It is the echo of the word home, spoken by a voice we no longer possess. It is the shape of the sun behind closed eyes." The sea wraith bowed his head, and for a moment the folds of his cloak fell like mourning drapery around him, obscuring the shape of the man he once had been. As they crested a low ridge, the land beyond opened like the slow unfurling of a scroll, revealing a valley rimmed with pale birches and silvered willows, their leaves glinting with frost. A small stream ran through its heart, barely more than a trickle, but its path glittered in the light, winding like a sliver of moonlight set into the earth. Mist hung low over the ground, curling like breath from a dreaming beast. The Nazgûl slowed as they descended into the hollow, the horses moving with uncanny grace, hooves never cracking a twig nor splashing the shallow water. And it was here, in the soft hush of the valley, that another spoke. A voice thinner than the others, barely a thread of silk pulled through a thimble of ash. The youngest of the 9, if such a term still held meaning. He had been a poet once, a singer in the courts of a king, before envy of the crown's weight had led him to wear one of his own. His hands had penned verses that once made queens weep and warriors pause. Now they clutched reins with fingers that no longer felt. "I dreamed," he said quietly, his voice the echo of rain on old parchment. "Last night, or what passes for it, I dreamed I stood in a field of gold, not of coin or treasure, but of wheat, tall and bending beneath a summer wind. And there was a child, no face, only the idea of one. They took my hand, and I wept, not in fear, but in release. When I woke, I did not wish to wake." The Witch King looked upon him, and though he said nothing, the silence that followed was a silence thick with shared understanding. It was not mockery that hung in the air, but the deep, aching pity of those who have long forgotten how to weep, but remember the shape of tears. And as the mist curled around them, and the stream whispered to stones that had never known fire, the Nazgûl rested, if such a word could be used for those beyond rest. They did not sleep, they did not eat, but for a few moments they stood still in the valley of frost and fading light, and the world, sensing their presence, held its breath. For even the land remembered the horror of their names, but deeper still, it remembered who they had been. And for that brief, impossible moment, so did they. Evening crept slowly upon the land, not with the theatrical flourish of a storm sweeping the sky, or the defiant retreat of a fading sun, but with the heavy melancholy of something ancient returning to its rightful place. The light waned not in streaks or bursts, but as if each leaf, each blade of grass, each stone along the riverbed had agreed in unspoken accord to relinquish its brilliance. Shadows lengthened with deliberation, reaching like long-forgotten regrets across the frost-laced meadow, folding the nine once again into the comforting embrace of darkness. For them, the night was not an enemy. It was a mirror, truthful, unyielding, and silent. The valley whispered around them, its voice a tapestry woven of the sighs of wind through brittle willow boughs, the slow trickle of the stream now thickening with the weight of the descending cold, and the rustle of unseen things moving beneath the surface of soil and memory. Above, the first stars blinked into being, tentative, pale, and cautious, as if unsure whether they dared to watch what moved below. And perhaps they were right to hesitate, for the nine were not merely travelers, not merely shadows upon the land. They were remnants of a time that even the stars had begun to forget. One of them, who had not spoken since the hills of Harad at last echoed with his name, now stirred. His cloak fell back slightly as he dismounted, his figure still towering, regal in posture though hollow in presence. His hand, gloved in a shadow finer than night itself, traced the air above a patch of dry reeds, their golden husks trembling ever so slightly as if they recognized something long lost. "There is a memory here," he said at last, his voice neither hoarser nor smooth, but suspended somewhere between echo and thought. "It lies beneath the surface, like roots beneath snow, forgotten, unseen, but never entirely dead." Another turned toward him, the one whose mind had once contained more languages than any library in the West. His voice, when it came, was brittle, like the cracking of ice over deep water. "Is it your memory that stirs?" he asked slowly. "Or the land's? For I have found of late that I cannot tell the difference. Sometimes I think the sorrow I feel is not mine at all, but the earth's mourning. Not for us, but for what we have become." The first Nazgûl stood for a long time unmoving, as though weighing the wind in his palm, as though deciphering the scent of distant fires in the twilight air. "Does it matter?" he replied almost gently. "What is the difference between a man who forgets himself and a world that forgets him? The result is the same, the fading of all things." From the shadows beneath the twisted limbs of a willow whose roots had split an old stone with time and patient pressure, came the voice of the Witch King, not raised, not commanding, but as certain and slow as the turning of the moon. "We were not always wraiths," he said, and his words did not echo, yet the valley seemed to still in their wake. "We were not always silence. Once we were noise. Once we were the clamor of crowns upon brows, of steel upon stone, of voices raised in song and in prayer and in war. We were men. We were kings. We were fools." There was no disagreement. None among them had strength enough to dispute what the Witch King said, nor the will to pretend otherwise. The fire of denial had long since flickered out in their hollow hearts. What remained was a deep and abiding clarity, cold and sharp as obsidian, as unyielding as the ring that still called to them across the distance like a star in the void. One of the others, once a warlord from the eastern steppes, his spirit etched with the dust of endless roads and the cries of dying men, spoke with a voice that rumbled like distant thunder. "I sometimes wonder," he said, "if our doom was not in the taking of the rings, but in the wanting, in the reaching, in the aching hunger that made us believe we were meant for more than the world would give. Perhaps the rings did not change us. Perhaps they simply unveiled what was always waiting beneath the skin." There was silence then, deeper than the silence that blanketed the land. For it was not the absence of sound, but the presence of something too vast, too sorrowful to name. Around them, the world shifted subtly, as if listening, as if breathing with them. The mist clung to the earth like fingers unwilling to let go, and the reeds near the water's edge swayed with a rhythm that suggested music remembered only in dreams. A frog called once, low and tentative, and somewhere in the distance an owl answered. Two notes in a song too ancient for even elves to recall. The Witch King turned his gaze toward the northern edge of the valley, where the land rose into jagged hills, their spines outlined against the darkening sky like the bones of great beasts long buried. "We must move," he said at last, though his voice held no urgency. "The ring grows nearer, and with it, so does the reckoning." But one among them did not rise at once. The youngest, the poet, the dreamer, remained seated upon a fallen stone, his unseen eyes fixed upon the surface of the stream, where the sky's reflection shimmered like memory seen through tears. When he spoke, it was barely louder than the breeze. "Do you ever think," he asked, "that if the world were quiet enough, if all the voices ceased, and the wind lay still and the stars fell silent, that we might remember our names?" No one answered. No one dared. For the thought was too painful, too tender, too close to hope. And hope was the most dangerous wound of all. And so they rode on, not with haste nor dread, but with the solemn determination of those who know their path is not chosen, but carved, etched into the bones of the world with ink made of their own forgetting. The valley faded behind them, swallowed again by mist and frost, and the soft, sighing hush of a land too weary to weep. And the nine, wrapped in cloaks that drank the light and voices that once ruled kingdoms, moved forward into the deepening dark. The stream behind them flowed on, patient and indifferent, but beneath its surface, something remembered. The landscape unfolded before them with a grim and haunted beauty, vast and raw, as if some ancient god had once sculpted the land in anger, then left it untouched for an age. The hills rose like the backs of sleeping giants, and the gorges between them yawned as if carved not by water, but by sorrow itself. Thin mists hung low along the ravines, threading themselves through the crevices like half-formed thoughts, while sparse pine trees clung to the cliff edges, their dark limbs bent and twisted as though in mourning. The soil underfoot, when visible, was ash-gray and veined with roots that reached up like pleading fingers. Far above, the clouds moved slowly, dense and metallic, pregnant with a rain that refused to fall, hovering between promise and memory, like a thought never spoken aloud. The Ringwraiths passed through this wilderness like regrets walking in single file. Their forms cast no light, no warmth, no shadow. And yet, the land recoiled from them in ways subtle and instinctive. The air grew colder in their wake. The birds fell silent in their boughs, and even the insects seemed to withdraw into the crevices of stone. The world recognized them not as men nor spirits, but as remnants of something undone, a wrong that had been buried, yet never healed. And though no voice rose to challenge them, the land itself offered resistance, not through force, but through silence so deep it became almost accusatory. They halted near a forgotten cairn at the edge of a crag, where the wind whistled like distant weeping. The stones were old, ancient even by the reckoning of elves, weathered to smoothness by centuries of rain and neglect. Lichen traced them in slow-growing runes, and between the gaps in the piled rocks, small shoots of brittle grass trembled in the breath of the mountain. It was a place of rest once, though now it bore only the memory. It was the scholar Wraith who spoke first, his voice unusually steady, as though something in this place resonated with a chord of familiarity long thought snapped. "This was once a road of pilgrimage," he murmured, not addressing any one of them, but rather the cairn itself. "Not a grand one, no columns or flags or statues, just a path worn into the mountain by footsteps, faith, and the need to believe that the climb meant something." The Sea King dismounted slowly, his movements measured and heavy, as if the very air bore weight. His gaze swept across the distant valleys below, where the evening light gathered in red and gold streaks, painting the world as if in the final brushstrokes of a dying painter. He spoke without turning. "I remember such places. Not this one, perhaps, but others like it. Places where people walked not for glory or conquest, but to lay down burdens too heavy to carry further. You would leave something here, a stone, a word, a memory, and in doing so you believed, perhaps, that the gods would unburden you." The Witch King stood beside the cairn, motionless as ever. Yet something in the angle of his head suggested contemplation. His voice, when it came, was colder than the wind, but slower, too, as though it had grown tired of its own sharpness. "And what would we leave if we could?" he asked. "What token do we have that might be laid upon this altar of forgiveness? A shard of our former selves? A regret still clinging to the shape of a name?" The poet Wraith approached, the folds of his cloak brushing the rocks like sighs, and knelt beside the cairn with emotion so reverent it seemed out of place among those who had long abandoned reverence. His voice was quieter than the others, but thick with meaning. "I would leave silence," he said. "Not the silence that we wear like armor now, not the void that echoes in our steps, but the silence I once knew at dusk, sitting beside the woman I loved." As we watched the lanterns being lit in the streets below, we said nothing because nothing needed saying. That silence, that peace, I would leave it here if I had it still. The others did not speak at first, but the moment seemed to settle upon them like snowfall, slow and inevitable, covering even the darkest forms in a blanket of shared understanding. The wind around the cairn shifted, not harshly, but with a touch of gentleness, as if it too were listening, curious perhaps, or simply aching to hear what had been buried beneath the centuries of cold and consequence. Then, from the edge of the clearing, the warlord spoke, his voice low and firm, like a drumbeat from the deep. "I would leave my pride," he said. "I built empires with it, shaped men into weapons with it, raised cities that bore my name because of it. And when the ring was offered to me, it whispered not lies, but promises shaped perfectly to fit the hunger that pride had already carved in me. But pride is a tyrant dressed in the colors of kings. I see that now. The scholar nodded, the motion so slow and weary it seemed drawn from the bones of the earth. Yes, he said, we were all seduced not by the ring's power, but by the way it mirrored the weaknesses we already nursed in secret. It showed us what we wanted most and made us believe we deserved it. That was the trap. Not the magic, not the immortality, not the domination. It was the flattery of our own deepest wounds. A silence followed, deep and dense as winter fog. And in that silence, a memory stirred, not spoken aloud, but shared like the faint warmth of a dying fire among those who no longer remember its name. For though the nine had long abandoned the languages of the living, they were not without communion. Their shared sorrow, their shared path, their shared loss. It bound them deeper than any oath of steel or parchment. They were the only ones who remembered each other's faces, even as those faces had faded into vapor and shadow. And in that shared remembering, however dim, there was still the whisper of something that once resembled humanity. As twilight fell in earnest and the sky turned to slate above them, they mounted once more. The cairn behind them remained, untouched, yet marked by their presence in ways no stone could show. They said no prayers, they offered no songs, but something passed between them that night, unspoken, ancient, and terribly fragile. And the road stretched on ahead, winding between the mountains like the tail of some great serpent dreaming of darker days. Above, the stars blinked in silence, keeping their own counsel. Below, the world held its breath, and the nine moved forward, not out of obedience nor rage, but because there was nothing else they could do. The path led them westward now, winding through a region where the mountains thinned and gave way to rolling hills clad in ancient heather and wild grasses the color of dusk. It was a place not often marked on maps, a hinterland known only to shepherds and ghosts, where the stones rose from the earth like half-buried memories, and the wind sang in voices long dead. Here the world seemed older, not merely in years, but in essence, as if time had curled inward upon itself and pulled beneath the soil. The trees, scattered and stooped, bore bark like aged parchment, and their branches reached not toward the sun, but downward, as though in mourning, or perhaps prayer. The air was cooler here, carrying with it a scent of water and loam, tinged faintly by something older than either, something metallic and sharp, like the tang of memory cut open. The sky above had turned the deep indigo of approaching night, and a fine mist began to gather in the hollows between hills, clinging to the grass like dew and crawling over the ridges with the quiet determination of time itself. Even the stars seemed reluctant to show themselves, flickering dimly behind thin veils of cloud, like watchful eyes uncertain of what they beheld. It was in this quiet that one of the nine, he who had once been a philosopher king, whose realm had prized thought over steel, whose hands had once held scrolls rather than swords, broke the stillness. His voice, though muted by the centuries, still carried that cadence of contemplation, the slow rhythm of a mind that had once sculpted truth from silence. "I have begun to wonder," he said, not loudly, and yet all of them heard him, "whether we ever truly sought immortality for its own sake. I think perhaps what we desired was not eternity, but escape. The one who had once been a warlord turned his hooded head slightly toward him, the darkness of his cowl stirring with the motion. "Escape from what?" he asked, his voice a low thunder under the earth. "From death? From judgment? Or from ourselves?" The philosopher gave a long pause before answering, and even the breeze seemed to still, waiting for his reply. "From limitation," he said at last. "From the unbearable knowledge that we are finite, that no matter how high we rise, how deeply we think, how justly we rule, there comes an end. The end is always waiting. It is written into the marrow of every moment we love. And that knowledge, it hollows a man." The poet, who rode some distance behind, spoke next, his voice a whisper full of longing. "Yes, there was a moment once, just after I accepted the ring, when I stood upon a high balcony in my city, watching the stars through a veil of fog. And I remember thinking, with this power, I will finally be free of the fear that steals sleep. I will no longer wake in dread of forgetting her face, of losing the sound of her laughter. But I was wrong. The ring did not preserve those things. It devoured them." The Witch King said nothing for a long time, his silence heavy, thoughtful. The land around them darkened as the moon rose, pale and wide, its light catching the mists and turning them to silver threads woven through the hills. A brook murmured somewhere in the distance, its song fractured by rocks, yet persistent, like an old story still trying to be heard. Finally, the Witch King spoke, and his voice was quieter than usual, almost distant. "Do you remember," he asked, "the first time you saw your own shadow stretched long across the ground at dusk? When you were still young enough to run from it, but old enough to know it would follow you?" "I do," the sea wraith answered. "I remember standing on a balcony of black marble, looking west as the sun sank behind the sea, and watching my shadow stretch into the banquet hall behind me. I realized then I could never outrun it, and perhaps deep down I never wanted to. Perhaps I sought to become it, to shed all the softness, the uncertainty, the trembling questions that made me human." There was a long silence after this. None dared to fill it quickly, for the weight of such a memory lingered like perfume from a sealed letter opened too late. Then the scholar, who had spent his mortal life seeking to name the stars and count the ages of the world, added his voice. "Is that not the tragedy of knowledge?" he said, his voice thin but piercing. "That the deeper we search, the more we uncover the shadow at the heart of all things? That the truth, in its purest form, does not comfort, but estranges? That the secret most terrible is not that we are small, but that we are not meant to last?" Their steeds moved slowly now, as if the earth beneath them grew heavier with each step. The hills loomed like sleeping thoughts, and the mists pressed close, weaving in and around the riders as though to listen, as though they too sought understanding. It was then that the youngest of them all, the one who still dreamed, the one whose voice trembled with the ghost of music, spoke into the hush. "What if," he said, "we were not meant to last because beauty is not meant to be possessed? What if all our striving to keep, to claim, to master was a mistake? Perhaps beauty exists only in passing, in the way the morning light strikes a dew-covered leaf for a single breath of time before it is gone. Perhaps we became wraiths not because we reached too far, but because we clutched too tightly." None replied. But in that moment, a shift occurred. Not in the world, but in the silence between them. It was a silence no longer made of emptiness, but of shared burden. And in that silence, each of them, in his own fractured way, remembered a single moment not of glory or conquest, but of stillness. A moment when they had stood before something beautiful and known they were unworthy of it, and loved it all the more for that very reason. The road wound downward into a hollow where the moonlight pooled like water and the grasses shimmered silver and blue beneath its gaze. The air was cool, tinged with the breath of unseen flowers blooming in defiance of the dark. And as they passed through this place, their voices stilled, not because they had no more to say, but because the world around them asked for quiet, and they gave it. Not as conquerors, not as kings, but as the shadows of men who once, long ago, had stood in awe of the light. The land before them changed again, not swiftly but gradually, with the creeping inevitability of seasons turning in places forgotten by calendar or clock. Hills gave way to lowlands where marshes stretched in quiet, labyrinthine sprawl beneath a heavy sky. The earth became soft beneath their steeds' hooves, exhaling damp, musky breath through moss and sedge. Pools of still water reflected the moon like shattered glass, disturbed only by the slow glide of unseen things beneath the surface, things that remembered the age of the world when even elves were young and men but a whisper in the great song of creation. The air was thick here, not only with moisture, but with memory, an ancient melancholy that clung to reed and rock, that made even silence seem too loud, too sharp, as if each breath carried the echo of a sorrow too large to name. Trees rose here and there, not in the proud manner of forests, but like the twisted hands of beggars reaching up through the mire. Their roots sank deep into black water, gnarled and bloated, while their limbs twisted skyward in painful, aching arcs, bearing leaves of a sickly hue, brittle as old bones. And through this ghost swamp the nine passed, gliding like specters upon a pilgrimage, not toward redemption, but toward the memory of what redemption once felt like. The youngest among them, the one who still dreamed of songs and laughter, whose mind, though tattered, clung to beauty like ivy to a ruin, was the first to speak in this place. His voice, quiet and soft as the fog that wrapped around them, seemed to ripple through the stillness like a skipped stone. "There is something about this land," he murmured, his words tentative, as though afraid to wake the sleeping mirror. "It remembers, not clearly, not kindly, but deeply, as if even the waters have dreams, and all of them are of grief." The philosopher, riding close behind, nodded slowly, and the folds of his black hood shifted with the motion, revealing the barest hint of a face long since faded to shadow. "Grief is the most faithful companion," he said after a pause, and his words, though spoken gently, struck the air like stones dropped into still water. "It remains long after joy has departed, and even after memory fails, it lingers like the scent of smoke in a ruined home. It may not always have a name, but it knows yours." There was a long silence then, broken only by the creak of saddle leather and the whisper of their passing. Even the wind seemed reluctant to rise, and the waters offered no song, only the dull, persistent sound of distant ripples. Then the Sea King spoke, and his voice, deep as the ocean trenches, carried the gravity of lost things. "There was a harbor once," he said slowly, as though peeling the words from stone. "Far to the south, hidden in cliffs veiled with mist. I built it not for warships, but for poems, for evenings spent watching the light bend over water. I built it for her, for the woman whose laughter was like sails catching wind. She is gone now. The harbor is stone and rot. And I cannot remember the name we gave it." His voice faltered, and for a moment the only sound was the hollow wind brushing reeds like the fingers of a blind child reading forgotten songs. The Witch King turned his head slightly, as if to listen more closely to the wind, or perhaps to the silence beneath it. When he spoke, his voice was slow, careful, as if tracing the edge of a blade long buried in the soul. "Do you ever wonder," he said, "whether we could have been forgiven if we had turned back early enough? If, before the last light left our eyes, we had cast off the rings and fallen to our knees, not in defiance, but in surrender?" The warlord, his form massive and unmoved, answered with the softest of growls, but his words carried more weight than any shouted curse. "Surrender is only redemption when the soul still remembers what it bows to. We passed that crossroad long ago, and now the road behind us is ash." "But even ash," said the poet quietly, "was once a tree, and every ember remembers the fire." That line lingered in the mist between them, not as argument, but as question. Not as hope, perhaps, but as its echo. They rode for a time in silence, not because there was nothing to say, but because their thoughts had grown too large for speech. Around them the marsh pulsed with quiet life, the distant croak of unseen frogs, the sudden splash of a fish breaking the surface in some silent panic, the gentle drip of water from overgrown branches. The air smelled of earth and rot, and something sweeter beneath, something floral and faint. Perhaps the ghost of blossoms that bloomed in springtimes long past. Even decay, it seemed, carried beauty, if one listened closely enough. It was the scholar who finally broke the quiet again, his voice weary but clear. "Perhaps," he said, "our tragedy lies not in the evil we served, but in the belief that we were the authors of our own stories. The ring did not steal our will, it shaped it, like a mirror tilted slightly, showing us a path we believed we had chosen. But perhaps choice itself was always an illusion, and we were only ever walking the lines fate had drawn for us." "No," said the Witch King with a certainty that chilled the air. "The lines were drawn, yes, but we held the quill. We pressed it to the page, even knowing the ink was made of our own pride." A pause, a stillness. Then the warlord spoke again, his voice quieter than before, but steadier. "Then perhaps it is not too late to write something else. Not redemption, no, that road is gone, but truth, at least, the telling of it. If nothing else, let us be honest at last about who we were and what we became." Their path turned then, climbing out of the mire and toward a ridge where stones rose like teeth, ancient and jagged, bearing strange carvings half erased by wind and time. And as they ascended, the sky above them cleared just enough to reveal the stars, cold, distant, and immeasurably vast. They watched in silence those 9 hollow kings, and something passed between them. Not warmth, not peace, but recognition. For in the stars they saw not destiny, but distance, not hope, but truth. And in that truth, for the first time in many long years, they did not turn away. The wind had shifted by morning, rising slowly through the gullies and cracks in the hills, like the breath of some ancient beast just stirring from slumber. Its exhalation stirring the dew-heavy grasses and shivering through the crowns of the trees that lined the edge of the ridgeline, their roots clawing desperately into the stony soil. The land here was neither mountain nor plain, neither wild nor tamed. It existed in a kind of solemn in-betweenness, a threshold between the high desolations of the north and the deep, secret valleys of the west. Every step the nine took stirred the dust of forgotten paths, trails once carved by barefoot pilgrims and old wandering healers whose songs had not been sung in an age. The road, if it could still be called that, was narrow, broken in places by time and frost, but it held the ghost of direction, a quiet pull in the earth itself that seemed to whisper, "Forward, always forward," as though even the stones had surrendered to the inevitability of movement. They rode without words for a time, the air filled only with the low rustle of leaves brushed by unseen hands, and the distant, slow rhythm of a raven's wings as it passed overhead, circling wide, perhaps curious, or merely bearing witness. But beneath the silence rode other things, too, unspoken thoughts, memories cracked and worn thin like old silver coins, too faint to spend, but too precious to cast away. The nine were not as they had once been. Even a few days passed, something had shifted in them. Not as fire shifts into flame, but as embers shift into ash. Slowly, imperceptibly, but undeniably changed. It was the philosopher who finally broke the stillness, his voice rising from beneath his hood like a breeze caught in a library of ruins. "There is something in the air today," he said softly, more to the road than to any of them. "A tension, a thinning, as though the veil between things has grown fragile, as though the past presses close, as if it wishes to speak." The poet nodded from behind, his shadow long and wraith-thin in the morning light. "Yes," he murmured, his tone wistful, as if already listening. "It is the kind of day that begs to be remembered before it even ends." The warlord, less accustomed to such musings, but no stranger now to the thoughts they carried, shifted slightly in his saddle. "You speak of memory as if it were a gift," he said, his voice low, steady, bearing the weight of stones rolled uphill. "But for us, is it not more a punishment? A thing we once begged to retain, and now would pay anything to forget." The philosopher turned slightly, the folds of his cloak stirring with the movement. And when he answered, it was with the weariness of one who has carried the same thought for many lives, perhaps. "But even punishment can teach. Even pain can bear fruit, if one is willing to taste bitterness. We are what we remember, even in this half-life. And if we have nothing left but memory, then let it be honest." The Witch King, who had remained still and silent for hours, at last stirred, his steed coming to a slow halt upon the narrow path. The others, sensing the shift in him, paused likewise. He raised his head, and though his face could not be seen, there was a gravity to him that drew the air itself close. When he spoke, his voice was slow and measured, not cold, but deliberate, as though forging each word from the remains of something long buried. "Honesty is a kind of death," he said, For we built our kingdoms on denial, denial of weakness, of love, of mortality. To remember truly, to strip away the lies we told even ourselves, that is not mere sorrow, that is annihilation. And yet it is perhaps the only path that remains to us now. One of the others, the scholar, whose eyes once saw the stars not as distant lights, but as old companions, added his voice then, quiet but certain. "Then let us die honestly," he said. "Not in flesh, for that is long gone, but in illusion. Let the final act of our long unbeing be one of truth. Let the world see us not as monsters nor myths, but as men who failed, yes, but who knew in the end that they had failed." There was no answer at first, only the wind rising now through the gaps in the stone, bearing the scent of cedar and distant rain. The clouds above had thickened slightly, their bellies full with storm, though no lightning yet crowned their edges. Far below, a river wound through the valley like a silver snake, its curves ancient and gentle, its waters gleaming with a reflection of things long gone. Birds flew low across it, and the trees that lined its bank leaned toward its current like old friends. As they descended into that valley, their path becoming softer, grass replacing stone, the mood among them grew quieter still, not mournful, but thoughtful. The youngest spoke again, his voice fragile, but still laced with the music of memory. "I wonder," he said, "if she would know me now, if she would see the shape beneath this shadow and remember the boy who brought her violets in the spring. Would she flinch? Would she weep? Or would she simply look away?" His words lingered in the air like the fragrance of those same violets, fragile, persistent, not entirely welcome. The Sea King, who had once commanded fleets and feared nothing but silence, turned to him gently. "Perhaps she would do none of those things," he said. "Perhaps she would forgive, not because you deserve it, but because love, in its purest form, does not measure worth. It only sees the ache, and perhaps that is enough." They reached the river by dusk, its banks soft and green, the grasses humming faintly with the sound of life, crickets, frogs, the distant calls of unseen birds settling into their night roosts. The water moved with purpose, but not haste, a kind of serene inevitability that spoke of time, not as a tyrant, but as a companion walking at one's side. The 9 dismounted and stood there in silence, watching the current, each of them lost in thought. And the Witch King, after a long while, knelt by the water and touched it with the edge of his gloved hand, not to command it, not to test its strength, but simply to feel it move. He said nothing, but the gesture, small though it was, passed through them like wind through branches, and something ancient in the earth seemed to sigh. The river, slow and patient, moved like time itself, gentle in appearance, yet ceaseless, pulling all things in its path toward the sea, toward dissolution, toward remembrance. Its waters ran clear yet deep, a mirror both for the sky and for the shadows gathered around it. And the Ringwraiths, though they cast no reflection upon its surface, stood beside it in a stillness so profound it seemed not of this world. The sun had long since vanished behind the hills, leaving only a burnished twilight smeared across the horizon like the final brushstroke of a weary painter. The sky above was layered in bruised hues, lavender, charcoal, ash, and the stars, timid and veiled, blinked slowly into being like old souls returning to a watch they had never truly abandoned. The land here was soft and wide, shaped by millennia of water and wind, and the trees that lined the banks were tall and dignified. Willows, mostly, their long, silvered tendrils trailing into the river like the fingertips of mourners. They swayed in silence, stirred by a breeze that was neither warm nor cold, but full of memory. Even the earth beneath the Ringwraiths' feet seemed gentler, less resistant, yielding as if recognizing their weariness, as if honoring the gravity of what they carried. The Witch King remained kneeling, his gloved fingers touching the water's edge, unmoving for what felt like hours. Around him, the others had dismounted, some standing, some sitting upon stones or against the trunks of the ancient willows. Their forms still shrouded in darkness, but their presence no longer harsh or menacing. They were quieter now, not because they lacked thoughts, but because they no longer feared them. It was the scholar who finally broke the silence. His voice was as soft as falling leaves, yet tinged with the sharpness of thought that had once commanded kings and councils. "Do you ever think," he said, "that the world itself remembers us more clearly than we do? That the waters recall our first steps more vividly than we recall the crownings or the battles or the vows we once made beneath stars like these?" The poet, who had taken to tracing circles in the dirt with the long, thin branch, looked up slowly, the motion almost hesitant. "I believe it does," he answered, though not out of cruelty. "The world forgets nothing, but it does not linger. It does not ask us to remember. It simply holds the memory in our place, and when we are ready, or broken enough, or brave enough, it offers them back to us." The Sea King, his form half shadow, half regret, leaned against the gnarled roots of a willow and stared at the current with the gaze of a man who had once read omens in the waves. "That is the difference," he said slowly, "between us and the sea. It carries all things, but it claims nothing. We, on the other hand, we clutch too tightly. We tried to hold on to empires, onto names, onto love itself, as though they were coins we could keep hidden forever beneath our tongues. But nothing endures when it is clenched in a fist." The warlord chuckled then, though the sound was devoid of mirth. It was the sound of splintered wood, of old gates sagging on their hinges. "And yet we still hold on," he said, "not to kingdoms or wealth, perhaps, but to the ache of what we lost. We cling to sorrow because it is the last thing that reminds us we were once alive." The youngest of them, who had remained seated at the edge of the river, his hands resting in the moss, tilted his head as if listening to something far away. "I dreamed again," he said so quietly they nearly missed it. "I saw the fields from my youth, green and wide, under a sky the color of hope. And there was music, faint but familiar, like laughter echoing down a long corridor. And for a moment, just a moment, I was not this. I was only myself." They all turned toward him then, not in scorn, not in denial, but with the fragile silence of those who had forgotten how to dream. The philosopher, his voice worn and layered like pages in a forgotten tome, spoke next. "Perhaps that is the final cruelty of our condition, not the loss of power, nor the fading of form, but the warping of memory. We remember love, but without the warmth. We recall beauty, but not its breath. We carry the weight of our sins, but not the reasons we once believed they were necessary. We are fragments now, and yet even a fragment can reflect the whole. The Witch King rose then, slowly, his fingers leaving the water like a final farewell. The river, disturbed only for a breath, resumed its flow without protest, as if it had expected this moment all along. He turned to face them, and though his form was as dark and terrible as ever, there was something changed, an absence of menace, perhaps, or the presence of weariness so deep it had become clarity. "We are close," he said, and the words were not command, but simple fact. "The ring draws nearer, its shadow touches the world again, and we are called. But we are not as we were." The others rose one by one, as if summoned not by his words, but by the truth within them. They stood not as conquerors, not as wraiths, but as men who had walked too far and carried too much, and who now, at the edge of all things, found themselves still standing. The wind rose with them, threading through the trees, stirring the grasses, lifting the mist from the surface of the water. The stars brightened, scattering their light like memory across the firmament, and for a single moment the nine were illuminated, not with brilliance, but with recognition. They were not yet free. They were not yet forgiven. And as they turned from the river, mounting once more, the world did not flinch from them. It watched, and it listened, and it waited. And the nine rode on, not as they had been, but as they had become. Shadows with names carved deep beneath the silence. Echoes of men who once dared to dream. And somewhere far ahead, across hills and time and fate, the ring awaited. But behind them, in the water's song and the hush of the trees, something lingered. A promise, perhaps, or a prayer.